Welcome everyone to this week's Neurotheory Forum, which is a joint venture with my lab here at Oxford and Tim Vogel's lab at IST Austria. So we're fortunate this week to have Dr. Timothy O'Leary, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Engineering at Cambridge. And he's done a wide range of work looking at a range of problems in theoretical neuroscience, but maybe you've seen his work on sort of fundamental limits on learning in neural circuits. And I guess today we'll hear about work on how representations can change in some ways while still maintaining other features of their function. And just a note about the setting here. So we invite you to ask questions. If you have a clarification question, you can put it in the chat and I will pose it to Tim. And then you can also, if it's sort of a broader question, you can use the ask a question functionality and we'll pose those at the end of the talk. And then we'll also have a Zoom discussion afterwards, which you're all invited to. I hope you'll come, where you can just informally ask questions or just stay to listen if you like, as you wish. And I'll send out the Zoom link for that at the end. So with that, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so I'll get started by describing an experiment that some of our collaborators did a number of years ago. So this is an experiment done by Laura Driscoll in Christopher Harvey's lab, involving a setup that's by now quite familiar in systems neuroscience. So this is I've just lost my mouse pointer. So let me try and recover my mouse. There it is. Okay. So we have a mouse located on a ball. It's been shown a virtual environment and it can move around. And because its head's fixed on this ball, this allows high resolution 2-photon imaging, calcium imaging of neural activity in the cortex. And the task that Laura gave this mouse was relatively simple. The mouse has to run down this T-maze, identify a cue at the start, and then make the correct turn left or right at the end associated with the corresponding visual cue. And the mice in this task that were studied learned it essentially to expert level and sustained their performance over a long period of time, for a month, and imaging was done over this time period as well. Briefly, the brain area that was being looked at was the posterior parietal cortex. It's located here in the brain. And I like to think of it essentially as a sort of sensorimotor area. It's not directly connected to the external world, if you like. So it's not a primary sensory area or a primary motor area, but it's crucial for solving this task and for a number of kind of sensory motor tasks as well. So it's a good place to look for a representation of the features of this task. And indeed, if we take trial averaged calcium activity, here we're depicting the start of the trial here and the end of the trial here, and we average it over a number of trials in a given session, what we see is that if the cells are sorted according to where they are most active, there's a nice tiling of this task along its duration and length, where they're active at each portion of the task. So in this sense, we can at least loosely or provisionally say that PPC activity represents this task. That's the sense in which I use this word here. However, 10 days later, keeping the same ordering of these cells, we see although the cells are still active, this nice tiling of the task seems to be lost. And then waiting several days later again, we see further scrambling of this nice pattern. So PPC activity seems to represent the task, but it drifts over days. Now, the representation hasn't disappeared completely, because at these later days, if the data are resorted and reordered, again, this nice tiling is recovered. So essentially, this representation is preserved, but it's moving around inside PPC for some unknown reason. So The big question is, why does this drift occur? It could be technical issues. It could be ongoing learning of this specific task that's very hard to detect. It could be unavoidable biological noise, ongoing changes that are occurring elsewhere in the brain, or something to do with the fact there might be spare degrees of freedom in this neural circuit that's representing this task. Now, the short answer is we don't know. It's likely to be combinations of a number of these things, but you'll also notice that I've listed these explanations in increasing boringness, and I trust that we can actually rule out, or at least set aside, some of these more boring explanations here, particularly in the experiments I described, because a lot of trouble was gone to actually ruling these out. So in this talk, it's split into two parts. In the first part, I'm going to ask whether this kind of drift poses a problem for task representation generally. The classical paradigm that we're used to in neuroscience, going back perhaps to the days of Hubel and Wiesel, is that stable function might be equivalent to stable tuning of neurons in a particular part of the brain. However, the systems view holds that in a population code doesn't constrain single cell tuning. So there's a nice paper by Joel Druckmann, and making this point very clearly in a model, which essentially says that once you have a high dimensional representation of a particular task, the individual tuning of neurons can change. Okay? So that picture looks like this. If we represent neural activity on some axes, then essentially we can have a lower dimensional space, which could give rise to a constant, for example, linear readout, even though there are many different activity patterns exhibited in this space over time. And this space of equivalent patterns we could refer to as a null space for a particular linear map. So an obvious question in the data that I've just shown you is, does this stable coding space, this null space, actually exist? Is there evidence for it? Now, it might, but actually the data that I'm going to describe from this experiment suggests that actually there isn't a strict invariant null space, at least in the data in this experiment. So this leaves a question of how neurons in a downstream circuit or the rest of the brain would find or even maintain a stable readout of the information represented in this circuit. In the second part of the talk, I'll get to some theory that tries to tie together some of these things and might explain why we have this continual drift and why we have this apparent redundancy in how problems are represented in the brain. But I'll describe more of that later. Okay, so in trying to understand whether there's any consistent representation in this PPC activity, the first question we might ask is, can we decode basic kinematic variables or behavioral variables from neural activity? So what I mean by that is that we have a kinematic variable that could be the position or velocity of the animal as it performs this task. We have neural activity, which is represented as a high dimensional vector time bind representing the, in this case, the calcium activity of the population of cells. And a very, very simple way of trying to decode this these kinematic variables is to do the simplest thing we can imagine, which is just to try a linear decoder. So here we're going to ask whether we can extract the animal's behavioral variables from just a simple linear weighted sum of the neural activity. So before I continue, I need to give full credit to the people who pushed this work and led it. So there's Michael Rule and Adriana Loback, who worked on this in conjunction with people from Chris's lab, with Laura and Chris herself. So one motivation for linear decoder, before we move on, is that actually neurons and neural circuits do perform weighted sums. You know, you could draw a cartoon of a neuron and you can imagine, well, yes, it does extract some kind of readout from these cells, and downstream cells and downstream circuits essentially perform weighted sums in some sense. So this has a kind of neural readout of this activity. But the bottom line is that in this data, a linear decoder actually works quite well. So here we're showing holdout test data from a linear decoder that's constrained on this data, and we can see that the decoder does a reasonable job of predicting the animal's position along this track. We can also decode the animal's speed, and we can decode the animal's heading or its view angle. So we can reconstruct the animal's trajectory just by looking at the neural activity alone, and we can do this with a simple linear decoder. Now, you might not be surprised by the fact that the decoder accuracy, if the decoder is constrained on a given day, degrades over several days due to drift. So if we fit the decoder on a given day, which we'll call day 0, and then we test its predictions on a day earlier or a day later, or several days earlier or later, what we find is that the mean squared error in this prediction increases rapidly. And this shouldn't be a surprise because, as we've seen, the activity itself drifts over several days. But the question we started with was whether there was... Yes?
Tim? Sorry. Somehow your screen sharing has stopped.
Yeah. At what point did it stop?
Just now.
Okay. Yeah, the icons disappeared too, so let me try and go back. That's weird.
Yeah.
Okay. So are you seeing a rocky coast again? Great.
Yes.
Let me just restart where I left off. Okay, now are you seeing my slide? Great.
Perfect.
Okay.
Yep.
So yes, there's drift, and if we fit a simple linear decoder on a given day, we shouldn't be surprised that its prediction degrades over time. Now, one way of thinking about this is that if a downstream neuron tuned its weight so that it could read out information, a day later or a day earlier, that tuning would no longer be optimal or even perhaps even useful. But what we asked was whether we can actually find a drift invariant linear decoder. A very, very simple way to do this, because we already have the data, is to just take data from multiple days, concatenate it and form a training and a test set, and then fit a linear model to this concatenator. This way, if there is this drift invariant subspace, the concatenated model should show more or less equivalent performance to an optimized model on a single day, and automatically then be invariant to this drift. So what do we see if we do this? Well, we find that there is a sort of partially invariant subspace, so a concatenated model can do reasonably well, but it always does substantially worse than a model that's constrained on a single day. So if these fluctuations were essentially a stationary noise, and this drift over time was really just reflecting stationary noise that could be averaged out, we would expect that we could achieve more or less equivalent predictive power with a concatenated model as with a model that's fit on a single day, but we can't. So it seems like perhaps there is a certain amount of drift that's occurring outside this nice null space that we described earlier. So the data suggests that this linear invariant space doesn't exist. To check into this further, we actually constructed a concatenated model over several days, and then let predictions of that model run on holdout days. And what we found was that even if we did constrain a concatenated decoder, there still is this gradual drift in the decoding performance. However, if we compare the drift in that concatenated decoder with how rapidly the prediction error would accumulate where there is completely random drift in the neural population. So you could imagine adding identically distributed noise to every single neurons tuning in the population, that produces drift which is much more rapid than what's seen in the data. So another way of saying this is that the drift that's occurring in PPC is far more systematic and constrained than the random walk in the full space of neural activity. In fact, I'm not showing it here, but if we actually take some form of random walk model, in this case a Gaussian random walk model, or one that's fitted to the statistics of the PPC activation, if we constrain that random walk to sit on a lower dimensional subspace, then we get a drop-off in predictive performance that can match the data. So one plausible model of this drift is that actually there is a reconfiguration, but it's happening in a lower dimensional subspace than the full space of neural activity. Okay, so given that this perfect drift invariant null space hasn't been detected, at least in this data set, over the time where the recordings were available, this leaves open a few questions. So one question, obviously, is how much plasticity might be required to track drift. So if we wanted to maintain a stable readout downstream, how much would these weights need to change? And what Michael and others came up with was a really neat way of addressing this question regardless of any underlying plasticity mechanism. So this is how we went about it. So here's the situation where if we had a linear model where is an invariant multi-day decoder, then essentially what this means is that if we depict with these ellipsoids the error surface in weight space, where the error of the model is beneath a certain value, then there's an overlapping spot where we can find a consensus decoder that over several days we get performance that fits within some tolerance. Is substantial drift that we have looks like the following. So there might be a consensus decoder that fits within the neural code changes such that we can no longer actually find a consensus. So instead of trying to find a consensus, where we fit the data over multiple days and allow a penalty in weights from day one to the next day. Okay, so what this allows is the weights to adapt by a certain amount that's controlled by this parameter lambda that gives change over time. And importantly, this allows the weights to change in an arbitrary direction. And that's why of any kind of plasticity mechanism, if we want to interpret. So what we find here is the following. So, or the decoding accuracy for a model that's optimized on a given day. And as we said before, a concatenated model always does worse over multiple days. But if we allow these models where the weights gradually adapt, then for a fairly modest amount of weight adaptation, so something of the order of maybe 50% per session, we can get pretty good tracking of this drift over time. So one way of summarizing this is to say that yes, you can actually track this drift with a modest change in a linear readout, and the amount that the individual weights need to change is perhaps something that would be feasible if we interpret these weights as synaptic connections. This then led us to the question of whether actually a biologically plausible local learning rule could track drift, and the answer is it can. So Adriana Lobach chose to test a well-known online least squares algorithm, so-called LMS, delta rule due to Widrow and Hoff. So what this does is it takes a linear readout, takes a reference or some kind of prediction, to create a prediction, it compares this to a reference, and then the error is simply fed back as a scalar to change each of the weights in proportion to some learning rate. So this is a super simple learning rule, and it's actually equivalent to a kind of stochastic gradient descent, but it's occurring here really just over essentially a very, very shallow network, because we're just taking the readout of the single neuron and propagating the error back to these weights. So it's something, again, which could plausibly happen in a single neuron or a network. And the LMS algorithm can actually track this drift really well and give very good predictions. And it's able to track this within the kinds of bounds that Michael produced with this other analysis. So even with relatively few neurons, so we're talking in the order of a few hundred neurons, so a readout that's a weighted sum of a few hundred neurons, it's possible to track this drift, which doesn't seem to sit in a linear subspace, with a modest amount of plasticity and a local learning rule. Something about the way that this code reconfigured allows a local learning rule to track it very well. Okay, so let me summarize what I've said in this first part. First of all, this is just an observation in a number of experiments that neural representations essentially are degenerate, they're many to one, and they continually evolve over time. Number two, it's possible to track this drift with biologically reasonable weight adjustments. So this drift is not necessarily catastrophic for any kind of downstream brain area that's trying to extract this information. And the population code itself is far more stable than single neuron tuning, but at least in the data we looked at, there wasn't strong evidence for a completely invariant subspace. So going back to this picture of where PPC sits in the brain, we can sort of imagine that perhaps its job is to build some kind of model of the external world, and it does this by exchanging information with sensory and motor circuits as the animal is performing tasks, and probably receive some kind of error signal, reward signal, so that it's able to learn. If we think about this structure, and we sort of invoke this picture of a kind of homunculus that the PPC is part of, it's communicating with the world through a finite bandwidth channel. So via these other neural circuits and these perhaps indirect error signals. And within it, there are many, many degrees of freedom for building this model of the external world. Because as we saw, the representation of this, albeit simple task, was not unique. It evolved over time, and that can't really happen unless there's many spare degrees of freedom in the representational capacity of this neural circuit. So that sets up a number of questions that I'll get to in this second part, where I'll discuss some theory. So the first question is there a good reason for having degeneracy or these extra degrees of freedom in neural circuits? Okay. Conventional wisdom from statistics tells us that we shouldn't have far more parameters than we need to build a model based on data. But it seems that in this case, the brain is at least the naive interpretation of this is the brain might be breaking that. We don't know what the effective number of parameters is, but it seems like the brain is finding some kind of representation that isn't settling down, it's changing over time. So does that have some good reason, theoretically? And secondly, is there a good reason for representations of some learned task to continually drift? Once the brain has built this representation and this model of the world, why should it continue to move around? Why does it not make more sense for this representation to anneal and stay relatively stable? Okay, so to address the first question, we're going to step back and actually think about a very, very general learning scenario. So we're throwing away a lot of biological detail here, and we're thinking really about an abstract general learning setup. So we have some kind of network, neural network, some kind of task, and some kind of learning rule. And this network, of course, is going to require to learn over time. So it's going to receive error feedback at certain points in time, and then it's going to gradually reduce its error. We're going to assume that the learning rule is not perfect, so there's some degree of noise in the learning rule. And what we're going to do to address this question of degeneracy is actually consider a situation where we have a family of networks of different sizes. But the way that we're going to resize this network is we're going to keep essentially the same numbers of inputs, same numbers of outputs, and merely add units and synapses in the to the internal connections of this network. So we're essentially increasing the size of the internal state space of this network, but we're not changing its input or its output dimension. And then we're going to ask what this scaling or this change in the internal dimension, what effect this has on learning tasks of a particular complexity. So we've said that we're going to consider imperfect learning rules, but this leaves open the question of what kind of learning rule is even reasonable. This is a really difficult question because, if we're honest, we don't know what learning rules the brain actually uses. So really what we'd like to do is consider all possible learning rules. Now that seems ridiculous. That seems like a tall order. We'll put in some sort of constraint here. We're going to consider all learning rules up to first order, and I'll explain what that means in a moment. So let's go back to this picture of this network learning over time. It gets this feedback from the external world, and then it uses information from this error feedback to constrain its weights, and it gradually learns over time. So let's consider what happens in some finite time interval t. Well, the error function, which here we'll call f, if the network has learned, will have decreased over time. Okay, so f of wt should be lower than f of w at time t equals 0. And now, just invoking the fundamental theorem of calculus, we can rewrite this in the following way. So we can write this as the integral, essentially the line integral, of the change in weight. So this is the weight trajectory, function of time, with the gradient of the error function. Okay? So this step to this step here is almost a tautology. This is just rewriting this way, as rewriting this difference using the fundamental theorem of calculus, assuming that these quantities are smooth. Okay. But what that lets us also say is many possible paths and many possible error functions, that essentially this change is really just proportional to the expected correlation between the gradient of the error function and the trajectory that the weights take. Okay? And if the network learned during this time interval, that expected correlation is negative. So what that means is, regardless of the learning rule, over some time interval, weight changes must anti-correlate with the gradient of an error function on average. So, of course, for biologically realistic learning rules, the anti-correlation with the gradient could be weak, but it must be there. And what that means in practical terms for this abstract modeling framework is that we can model the effect, potentially very bad learning rule, as the synaptic change in a given time interval is a combination of a change that's parallel to the error gradient plus all other kinds of changes that don't occur in the direction of the error gradient. What that looks like geometrically, it's nice to have a picture. So in weight space, we have this unknown trajectory the weights take from start of learning to some later point. And because the network learns during this time interval, what this means is that the net change, so the average change, which is omega dot t, must be decomposable as something that has a net direction in the direction of the gradient, so the steepest descent direction, this error function, plus some other component that isn't correlated with the gradient, or in this geometric picture is orthogonal to the gradient. Okay? And that means we can simulate it, because we can construct neural networks we can compute error functions, we can compute the gradient of the error function, and then to simulate a learning rule with a given degree of correlation with the gradient, all we need to do is add some random noise that's appropriately normalized, and then we end up with a learning rule that spans the range from being very, very good, perfect gradient descent, to very, very bad, which doesn't move in any direction associated with the gradient. So that explains how we can match this. So what we have is gradient descent, and we have some degree of noise in it that enumerates learning rules that have all possible levels of quality up to and including perfect gradient descent. The next question is, what type of tasks we'd actually want to consider for this network. And again, we'd like to consider all tasks because we want this framework to be general. But clearly, it doesn't make sense to really consider all tasks. We want to consider all possible tasks that the network can actually solve. So how do we do that? Well, Dhruva, who led this work, went away and looked essentially through the AI and neural network literature, and he found this rather nice, commonly used setup called the student-teacher framework. So what you do here, if you're looking at feed-forward neural networks, which we were for the results I'm going to show, is you take two kinds of network with the same architecture. One is called the teacher network, weights. The other is called the student network, and this has essentially the same topology as the teacher network, but the weights here can, of course, be adapted. And because these weights are fixed in the teacher network, that means it calculates a static input-output function. So this gives lots of input-output data pairs that can be used to train the student network. And because the student network can be constructed to have exactly the same topology in principle as the teacher network, we know that in principle the student network can perfectly solve this task. Okay? So this gives us a way to compute a task. The error in this task is then propagated through a learning rule, which is gradient descent, and we have our general learning setup. So that's a lot to set up, and I think it's important to go through some of the technical details so you can see how this was done, at least in simulation. Now I'm going to tell you what the main finding is. Okay, so this is the place to pay attention in briefly. So the main finding is as follows. Let's look at a learning curve for this student network in the case where the student network here has exactly the same number of synapses as the teacher network. And here the network is learning with a noisy gradient descent learning rule. So it learns at a certain rate, and then the error sort of settles down in asymptotes. Now we're going to take that student network and we're going to add redundant or apparently redundant neurons and synapses only to intermediate layers of this network. We're going to keep the size of the teacher network the same, so it's learning the same class of input-output functions, except it's doing so now with higher redundancy in these intermediate layers. What we find is that as the level of redundancy or the amount of connections in these intermediate layers increases, the network learns faster and it achieves a lower steady state error. And this trend continues. So the larger the network is and the more redundant it is by construction, the better it learns. It learns more quickly and more accurately. Okay? So with an imperfect learning rule, what this suggests, and these are just simulations at this stage, is that excess connectivity allows a network to learn a task faster and to higher steady state accuracy. So now we would like to know what's going on. So at this stage, I'd like to credit as well Adriana Perez-Redondo and Dhruva Raman for really driving all of this work and for essentially nailing the analysis that explains why we get this boost to learning performance. The easiest way to look at this is to think geometrically. So what makes learning hard if we're following a gradient? Well, let's imagine our error surface looks like this with some degree of curviness. We'd like to get down here to the bottom where there's low error. And we start here, and our gradient descent tells us, well, we should move in this direction. And that's if it's perfect gradient descent. And if we start moving in that direction with some velocity and then over some time interval start to receive error feedback that tells us, that gives us new information, there's a chance that we overshoot the valley and we actually end up on the other side of it, simply because this error function is curved. And then what that means is that when we receive refreshed error feedback, we now maybe have to go back almost in the opposite direction and maybe overshoot again. So this phenomenon will be very familiar to anyone who's done optimization. Essentially says that the curvature or the Hessian of the error function matters a lot when you're doing gradient descent. And if you have a highly curved and highly eccentric error surface, then pure gradient descent can actually get a little bit stuck. And that can actually hinder learning and slow it down. It also means that the impact of random noise is higher, but I don't have time to go into why that is. So we can see this mathematically very briefly in the following way. We can ask what happens to our error over a time interval, assuming we're learning. And if we write things down this way, then we have this exponential learning rate k. So essentially we're assuming that the error at time t is some ratio, which we hope is less than 1, of our error at time 0. And if this is less than 1, that means our learning rate k should be positive. And if we do a simple Taylor expansion of this expression in terms of the error function and gather terms together, this is what Druver ended up with, is that we have a negative sign out here, and we know that the contribution from the gradient, so this is the correlation of the average weight trajectory with the gradient of the error function, we know this is negative on average because this is a learning rule that works. So we have an overall positive learning rate, unless these higher order terms are large enough to counteract the contribution that's coming from the noisy learning rule. In particular, the higher order term that we need to worry about is the contribution that comes from curvature, so involving the second derivative of the error function. So essentially, learning stops if we're using noisy gradient descent when these two terms approximately balance, neglecting higher terms, which turns out you can do under a lot of a variety of cases. So in summary, higher error surface curvature is the thing that makes learning difficult. And now the question is, well, what are the possible remedies to make learning more efficient? Well, one is, what the optimization people would do is to adapt the learning rule to curvatures, to use something like Newton's Newton update. We're going to assume that's maybe not biologically plausible because this involves second derivatives, not just first derivatives of the error function. But who knows? You can decrease the learning rate as you approach the minimum, but then we learn slower, and you also need an adaptive learning rule. Or you could decrease the noise in the learning rule itself, and that would be nice, but we have assumed that there is some degree of noise and imperfection in the learning rule to begin with. Or you could reduce the curvature of the error surface relative to the gradient. Okay? The gradient is the signal that matters here, and the strength of the curvature relative to that is the thing that hurts us. So if somehow we could alter that ratio, we could learn quicker. But how on earth can we do that? Well, it turns out to be quite straightforward in the setup that we have. So here's the main insight. When we do this network resizing, we are, as I said, changing the dimension of this internal state space without changing the dimension of the input-output function. So what that means is that there's some error function that's a function of the state space, there's a function of the weights. There's an n-dimensional function if there's n weights. sorry, it's a mapping from Rn to R, so it's a scalar function with n variables. And if we do this size expansion, then what we're really doing is embedding this error function in a higher dimensional space, n tilde. Now let's think about what happens here, at least locally. The general idea is that this embedding essentially, under certain circumstances, disentangles all of the kinks and bumps in the error function and allows naive gradient descent to do better in this higher dimensional space. And the reason that happens is that if we think locally, we think of a projection of this higher dimensional error function f tilde, well, that projection locally is an operator that has, it is a projection operator, and it may actually rotate the axes a bit, so it's a semi-orthogonal matrix. Essentially has n eigenvalues equal to 1 and n tilde minus n eigenvalues equal to 0. Okay, but it maybe rotates the state space a little bit. If we plug in a local expression for the gradient, this projection operator, so that we can compute the strength of the gradient relative to the strength of the gradient in this lifted function, then we get the following. Essentially, this is how the gradient scales. It's the ratio of these, the relative dimension of these two state spaces. And again, for the second derivative, the quantity that will matter, the quantity that hurts us essentially is the trace. So we think of this as being proportional to the average eigenvalue of the Hessian. Plugging in that action, we again see the scaling. And overall, what we end up with is a situation where the magnitude of the gradient scales with the square root of the size of this extra degrees of freedom of this embedding dimension, whereas the average eigenvalue of the error function doesn't really change. Okay? So the average curvature of this error function stays fixed, whereas the relative gradient increases, which is what we wanted. So just doing this very simple embedding, which is really just adding essentially redundant connections in the network, locally, on average, changes the strength of the gradient relative to the magnitude of the curvature. And if you're using gradient descent or something that approximates it, that will speed up learning. In summary, adding excess redundant neurons and synapses actually flattens out the outer surface. Okay? And it's that that makes learning easier. Interesting connectivity a lot in large nervous systems in areas of the brain involved in learning. So this is examples of cortex and hippocampus showing multiple synapses between a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell, even on the same axon. So here we have an axon that's actually making two identical connections with the same postsynaptic cell. So it's a really, truly redundant connection here. And similarly, elsewhere in hippocampus, we see these kinds of redundant connections occurring as well. Okay, so it seems like there might be a good reason for extra degeneracy, at least from the point of view of learning. There's probably many other reasons that degeneracy is a useful thing to have. But what we found here, which was published a couple of years ago, is that actually this can help boost learning speed and learning efficiency. The final question I want to get to here is whether there's a good reason for representations of a learned task to actually drift. And this is some work that's under review at the moment, again by Dhruva Raman, and I'm going to share it with you now. So a general observation is that synapse turnover in many parts of the brain, but particularly in cortex and hippocampus of intact behaving animals, is actually surprisingly high. So here's some nice data from a few years ago showing dendritic spine reconfiguration occurring over a timescale of a couple of days. And what we see is that there are dendritic spines that disappear, that are shown here, or that appear or grow from over a course of several days. So summarizing over time, what's seen is that over a time course of a week or two, about 50% of existing spines remodel and disappear, and then there's continual birth of new spines entering this population. So this is quite a lot of turnover. And some other experiments in much more reduced preparations. So the data I was showing was in a living animals. It was the auditory cortex of the mouse. But in reduced preparations, there's been attempts to separate out the changes in synaptic connectivity that are systematic from those that are random. Very, very hard thing to do. But here's a sort of indirect way of getting at that. So this is from Noam Ziv's group, and this is looking at neuronal cultures. So here we have a measure of spine turnover or synapse remodeling in a basal state. So that's shown in blue here. So over time, these spines gradually remodel. And then they're comparing these with a situation where activity has been blocked. So TTX is applied to the culture media, and this stops all electrical activity, and it has a profound effect on spine remodeling. However, 50% or more of the turnover in these synaptic protrusions continues. So if you believe that synaptic plasticity is a result of neural activity in some form, then completely blocking neural activity is not shutting down this synaptic remodeling. Whether we call this noise or not is debatable, but there's still some ongoing change. In a follow-up study, there was an attempt then to relate ongoing changes statistically to other measurable properties of these cells, so their activity history and other morphological or remodeling processes that were going on. And in a statistical sense, less than 50% of all of the remodeling could be actually correlated with other things that were going on in the cells. And that leaves this very large fraction that's seemed better explained as spontaneous synaptic autonomous noise or synaptic random process. So if we take this at face value, it looks like a little over 50% of ongoing fluctuations seem to be random. This seems like a lot. Okay. However, it is consistent with substantial circuit reconfiguration in the absence of any learning, and that's something that we've seen. It could be the method, species preparation. This is a very, very difficult thing to pin down experimentally, and I'd be very excited to discuss with experimentalists ways of doing this. But there is something interesting about this 50%. So why about 50% can't synapses actually constrain themselves so that they suppress fluctuations any further than this? We're going to argue that actually this proportion is optimal for maintaining a learned behavior in a very general sense. Okay, that seems like a big claim. And what I'm going to show you now is just some simulation results that corroborate the claim, and then just the mathematical intuition for why it's so. If you're interested in reading in detail, this is available as a preprint on bioRxiv. So going back to the same simulation setup where we had the student-teacher network, we have a general setup where we can essentially model learning in terms of synaptic plasticity, except now what we're going to do is introduce these random fluctuations. So any change that occurs in the synapses in these networks is not just a result of a noisy loop. There is also a synapse autonomous random noise process as well. And this will allow us to, this setup allows us to enumerate the relative strengths of this synapse autonomous noise to the systematic plasticity that comes from a learning rule. And then the result is as follows. So with a noisy imperfect learning, steady state error, so maintaining a steady, low steady state error of a learned task is minimized when systematic plasticity is no stronger than noise. okay? So what that looks like is the following. So here I'm plotting steady state error after the network has learned. So this is the long-term steady state error. And this is minimized when the strength of the change in the weights due to plasticity is roughly balanced with the strength of the noise. So balance is essentially the boundary between the yellow and the green plot here. If anything, you can see here that actually if the systematic plasticity is slightly weaker than the noise, the network hovers around at its lowest steady state error. That seems rather odd. Here we see it's a bit more systematically in nonlinear feed-forward networks, that if we increase the magnitude of the fluctuations, this relationship holds. And if we increase the quality of the learning rule by increasing the ratio of the gradient descent to the noise in the learning rule, then again we see that if anything, the optimal magnitude of systematic plasticity relative to fluctuations is actually less. So this is consistent with the observation that more than 50% of the ongoing changes in synapses, for some reason, appears to be a random process or something that's not involved in systematic changes. So why is this? Hopefully, in just a couple of minutes, I'll give you some intuition that will make this seem so obvious that you actually now believe the result. Let's think of an error function just in one dimension, and let's think now weight change that's due to a systematic part. So here's a delta W change in the weight. There's a systematic part, and then there's this annoying error that kicks us around in a random direction. Let's suppose we've learned perfectly, and we're at our lowest possible steady state error. And now we get this random kick. So this annoying noise kick moves us away. Well, the systematic plasticity that is always there maintaining the task should act to bring us back down the error surface to compensate for this change. And what you can see here immediately is that in this simple case, one-dimensional case, with a single global minimum, that if the restoring systematic plasticity is equal and opposite to the random kick, then we end up back where we started. However, if the restoring plasticity is actually stronger than that kick, in the long run, we're going to do worse because we're going to start bouncing around the edges of this error surface. In higher dimensions, that's kind of the case as well, except actually there are more paths, more available paths to follow. So if we were hovering around our steady state error, minimum or asymptotic steady state error in this network, you can imagine it being like the surface of a lake. We get this noisy kick that moves us away. In general, there's going to be a shorter path that brings us back to an equivalent level of error. What that means is that generically, the strength of any compensatory systematic plasticity should be no larger than the average strength of any kick in a given time step. So on average over time, the strength of systematic plasticity should be weaker than the fluctuations if you want to preserve any performance or memory in a network. Okay, so this is pretty much the end of the talk. Go back over the main conclusions. There's substantial ongoing synaptic reconfiguration in many parts of the brain that represent learned behavior. And this is not necessarily a problem for representing tasks, but at least in some of the data we looked at, it suggests that some continual plasticity is needed. And this observation, the initial observation, certainly suggests that there are degenerate representations present in the brain, which shouldn't come as a surprise. Perhaps what's more surprising is that this degeneracy, in a very simple way, can facilitate learning. And the optimal plasticity for maintaining a representation, once it's learned, should actually allow fluctuations to dominate slightly. Now, we were mostly considering these fluctuations to be noise, but if you think about it, any process that's relatively decorrelated across synapses that doesn't have anything to do with the task you're trying to learn could be considered a fluctuation. So taken together, these observations and some of the underlying theory may suggest how multiple representations can be learned efficiently without interfering, because we can consider the fluctuations as essentially being ongoing learning that's in some completely unrelated task. So finding that actually to maintain a learned state requires less corrective action than we might imagine in a degenerate network means that maybe there are mechanisms that can allow continual learning of multiple representations and multiple tasks, which must be the case without these tasks interfering with each other. So I'd like to thank everyone who made this work possible. First of all, I thank Tim Vogels and Jessica D'Antoni and Andrew Sachs as well, of course, for hosting this talk and for inviting me. Dhruva Raman really drove the theory that I spoke about in the latter half of the talk, together with Adriana Perez-Redondo, who helped a lot, making sure the maths was correct and picking us up in some places we went wrong. Michael Rule and Adriana Lobach were responsible for the work I discussed at the beginning of the talk, analysing this data, which came from our collaborators, Christopher Harvey and Laura Driscoll. I'd like to thank other lab members who kept us going through all of this work and offered a lot of really important feedback and inspiration as well. And of course, I'll thank the funding from ERC and HFSP. And I'm very happy to have questions and an extended discussion about this topic.
Thank you. I'm the only one who gets to clap audibly, but thank you very much. Absolutely beautiful work. So for our audience, you can put any questions you have into the Ask a Question facility. And if you want to come up on screen, just note that. And otherwise, I will ask it for you. And we've already got a couple of questions. This is a really excellent one to start off with from Kevin Mitchell. He asks, there is generally an exuberance of synapses early on which get pruned later. Does that pruning improve performance after a lot of learning, which takes advantage of all that redundancy? Sorry, after a lot of learning has already happened. So that, you know, the learning process might need the redundancy, but would you be better off pruning afterward?
That's a brilliant question, and it's one that actually Adriana initially wanted to focus on in her PhD project. So the answer is essentially yes, that you could, a strategy that could work if you want to get essentially from a very bad unlearned state to doing reasonably well quickly, add lots of synapses, add an exuberance of synapses. And what I didn't discuss in this work, but in the paper, so that's in the reference that I gave earlier, the 2019 paper, is that actually if each of these synapses contributes its own internal noise, that the benefit of having extra synapses eventually gets outcompeted by the noise that's present at those synapses. So there's a sweet spot. So you could imagine, and I think other people have actually proposed this, is that the brain generates all this extra connectivity temporarily, and then when it's no longer beneficial, it starts pruning it away, and that actually allows it to have an adaptive learning rate that trades off learning performance when the network is doing badly with precision when it's already learned reasonably well. There's probably lots of other reasons for synaptic exuberance and pruning as well, but that's definitely one of the ones that just falls out immediately from that analysis.
Yeah, that's a really interesting suggestion. Okay, and from Chaitanya, we have, in the drift experiments, the total number of neurons remains the same. In part 2 of your talk, you showed that addition of neurons to the middle layers of the networks helps with error loss. Would this also work when the total number of neurons is constant? Meaning, I guess, pruning neurons from the middle layers of the network.
Right. Okay. So this is where I should clarify. So where we were adding neurons, we weren't adding them dynamically, first of all. What we were doing was essentially enumerating levels of redundancy in the network. So we started off in the student-teacher framework. Am I still sharing my screen? Because maybe I can.
Yes.
All right. Let me bring up the relevant slide, and it will help instead of me just waving my hands. Yeah. So here we are. So what we're doing here is adding these additional connections and adding these additional neurons, just as and rerunning the learning on the same sets of inputs and outputs. So we have a teacher of a fixed size, in this case 145 synapses, pretty small neural network, and a family of student networks that are of varying sizes, and we're simply comparing their learning performance among each other. And in all but the first case here, so the red case is where the student has the same number of connections as the teacher. In every other case, there is a redundant, there essentially is a redundant network. There are more connections than are strictly necessary for learning the mapping that the teacher has, okay? So what I'd say is that all of these cases actually correspond to the biological case. We're actually assumed that the network is already redundant. We're not assuming that something changes in the network to make it redundant. We're examining the consequences of an existing redundancy, saying essentially the PPC has far more degrees of available degrees of freedom than it needs to learn a typical task, especially a very simple one. I hope that clarifies it. I can't see the question or the person themselves.
Yeah, I think so. And Chaitanya, if you want to ask more, you can just pop it in the chat.
Thanks.
Maybe I can add,
because it's quite important that distinction is clear.
Yeah, a few other clarifications on that, if I can add them. So first of all, is this teacher network, are you injecting output noise, or is this a noise-free teacher network?
It's a noise-free teacher network, but there's noise in the learning rules, so it's equivalent to injecting noise in the outputs.
I see. Okay.
Every gradient step that's taken, there's also a bit of a random kick as well. So you could do it either way.
And then you're in the online setting, so there's no batch statistics. Yeah, okay. Exactly. It would be interesting. I mean, I wonder what would happen if you thought you were doing this through replay of a fixed batch, because all of a sudden things could be way more complicated.
Yeah. This is all, so that's another good point. This is all online learning, so in the jargon. So essentially the network is shown as a data each time step, right? And it's learning in that way, which we think mimics some aspects of learning. But in artificial neural networks, what you tend to do is have a whole batch of data and compute a loss across that. It's not crazy that the brain might do the same thing. And maybe this is what you're driving at, Andrew, because we have fast and slow learning systems in the brain. This is going way off everything off the topic of what I've actually discussed here. But I think it's a really interesting idea. So the hippocampus is a very fast learning system. So essentially in one shot, more or less, an animal experiences a new environment. You experience an episode, a sequence of events that happened to you in the day. You can recall them, not perfectly, but you've essentially got a volatile memory store that you can reaccess, let's say, at will. So it's sort of like a flash RAM that's a bit unreliable. If you had that data set accessible, or rather if another part of the brain had that data set accessible, it would be able to parse over that data set and actually learn offline. So I am convinced that that's what happens in some form. It must happen. So really what we've done here is analyzed a super extreme case, a very impoverished case, where a network basically has one shot at learning each data point. It's seeing data from the same distribution, but it's having to do its learning with essentially no memory to store this accumulated data. Maybe it's actually a reasonable model, and this is actually linked to the PhD project that Adriana is following. Maybe it's more relevant for a structure like the cerebellum that sees these rapid sequence of events and maybe can't hold on to them. So it needs to adapt pretty quick, possibly, over repeated attempts, repeated trials. But really it wants to learn extremely quickly and hopefully accurately with very limited data. So it might be actually a better model of a structure like that. I don't know if that's what you were thinking.
Yeah, that was exactly,
okay.
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking. Great. So Anal Kumar asks, is this similar to the basin hopping optimization algorithm? Could the noisy synapses be helping in finding a global minimum rather than the local minima in case of non-noisy synapses?
Okay, I don't know what the basin hopping algorithm is, but it sounds like something using a sort of annealing process where you do an optimization and then kick things around randomly. That's not really the framework that we're thinking about, because so all of the analysis that I've shown here is a local analysis of learning. It says essentially over short times, over short changes, small changes in weights, what happens, and what happens in a local minimum, and what happens when you're away from a local minimum, right? Something that's hopping between multiple minima invokes the global structure of a loss function, but it's not something we've really dug into. What I'd imagine, and this must be true, is that if you have a highly redundant network, then these local minima are joined up in some way. Essentially, instead of having isolated local minima, you have a minimum sitting on a manifold somewhere. And that's going to be a manifold that's quite contorted and compressed into some volume, which could be relatively small. So what that means is that in this picture, so let me again pull up a slide, and I'll also say, again, I'm wandering off the topic that we're on. So this picture is really about a local minimum, right? But let's imagine that there was another valley down this side. Well, you could then argue that a fairly crude learning rule, as long as it has some relatively good feedback on what its current error is, can afford to jump over intermediate maxima and fall into neighboring local minima, as long as we can be confident that those local minima are close. Maybe it's the case that certain kinds of redundancy and certain kinds of task structure ensure that you have many local minima that are equivalent or close in their error magnitude that are also relatively close. So that
saddle points than local minima that you get stuck in.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Martin Blazik asks, you mentioned that the drift phenomenon has been described in the PPC. Do you think it might be observable across the entire neocortex?
It's been observed, to my knowledge, in piriform cortex, that's olfactory cortex, primary auditory cortex, maybe visual cortex, but I might be not recalling the literature very well. So it has popped up in a number of places already. So, if I said, I'm going to predict it'll be found in other places, then I'm not really predicting anything because it has been. I guess some of it, to some extent, is a bit unavoidable. we did downplay the role of random reconfiguration and sort of other less interesting processes that go on in a large brain. But I think the fact is that if you have, 86 billion cells and you have thousands of connections between each of them, the amount of control authority you need to maintain all of those connections at their right value, whatever that is not realistic. So things are going to move around a bit anyway. Whether occurs in the same way in different brain areas, I think, is a really cool question. So in particular, the rate at which it occurs. So I've argued here that the drift is consistent with maintaining task performance at an optimal level and allowing other kinds of learning to take place simultaneously, and also make this learned representation robust to unavoidable noise. If, for example, you somehow ate up those available degrees of freedom, for example, by learning a really complex task really well, or by having fewer neurons to learn the task, or by learning more tasks, then perhaps the rate of drift would slow. So I think it's an interesting question as to whether actually this rate of drift within a brain region is something that can change, and whether across different regions it changes as well. All of these things link back to the complexity of the task and how quickly it is to learn crudely, rapidly, or refine your learning over a longer time scale. All of those things play off against each other. So I think it's exciting that we're actually able to see this in lots of brain areas. I think we can now start to interpret that.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I'll add as well, in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised, really, right? I mean, when you sort of think with 2020 hindsight, you've got an adaptive part of the brain that's learning under a high level of uncertainty, with lots of other things going on in the animal's life. Why would we expect neural responses to remain fixed, stable in time? It seems like a lot to ask, and it seems like in retrospect this kind of had to be the case. But for whatever reason, we're just not very good, I don't think, at anticipating that, or I'm not, at least. Yeah,
I guess I think I completely agree if you think learning is driving a lot of the representational sort of formation in neocortex, but maybe that's the alternative, is what if learning just wasn't playing a big role?
Or even just consolidating and sort of relearning things. Sorry, do we need to move to a different venue?
No, but we've got one more question. I'll just pose it and then we can shift over to the post-talk Zoom. So last question, how does homeostatic plasticity fit into this framework?
Okay, it fits because it does fit, and it is yet another process that's going on. So I talked about a change in a weight, and let's be relaxed about what we mean about a weight. It is some parameter that affects a neuron's excitability or a neuron's activity in some form that can be used to store information. So one reason those things can change is because the circuit is learning. Another reason is because the circuit is unable to stop them moving. And the other reason is that there are systematic changes that have little to do with learning per se, but are important physiologically. Those would appear as these task-independent changes that we described. So they fit in precisely as that, and they're likely to be of the kind that's more systematic and correlated across a population, and therefore less destructive than completely random noise. So that's what I'd say, that's where those fit in. They can be accommodated in this framework. We just didn't account for them specifically.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much for the talk, and the Zoom link to join is in the chat, and please, feel free to come. Just you can listen, you can ask questions. It's your time. See you at the next one.
Thank you.